I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. To Jeff Wetzler, the author of Ask, you've got a substantial subtitle. Tap into the hidden wisdom of people around you for the unexpected breakthroughs in leadership and life is kind of the long thing. But Ask is a short title, but super long subtitle. I got the book as a gift from our mutual friend, Tom Rooney, who's a superintendent, just retired superintendent from a school district, Lindsay School District in California. He kind of pressed it into my hand like a sacred text. He said, you have to read this book. And so I thought, well, that's nice. And then I opened it up and I devoured it the whole way coming home on the plane. I read the whole thing. By the time I got to, I think even before I left the plane, I'd sent an email off to Tom to say, can you set up a podcast? I'd love to talk to Jeff about the book. And I'm so grateful for the conversation. Jeff is the co-founder of Transcend, which is an innovation organization, does a lot of great work with educators. Before that, he was the Chief Learning Officer at Teach for America. He works with Fortune 500 corporations as a consultant. Got his doctorate from Columbia University. He's an Edmund Hillary Fellow and an Aspen Global Leadership Fellow. And I'm going to ask him more about Transcend as we work through the podcast. His book, Ask, I've seen it on many best books of 2024, like the Next Big Idea Club featured it as a key book. And it's on my list as well. He's got a foreword from Amy Edmondson, is one of my heroes, and endorsements from people like Kim Scott, Adam Grant, Parker Palmer, Seth Godin. And then I'm going to stick me on that list of people because I love the book. I think it's really, really a wonderful book. Anybody who's interested in leading change will benefit from reading the book. So I'm excited to welcome you to the podcast, Jeff.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, Jim. Very excited to be here.
So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how the book came to be. Most books have an origin story. So what's the origin story for Ask?
Yes. So you and I share a common intellectual hero named Chris Argyris, who was one of the founders of the field of organizational learning and even organizational behavior. Had been a professor at Harvard Education School and Harvard Business School. I had the good fortune to work with him at my first job out of college and to learn from him. He studied one very particular question, which was, how is it that sometimes the smartest, most educated, most, quote, successful people are the worst at learning and are the worst at learning from other people? And Chris really delved into that question and had some fascinating findings, but he was not the kind of person who would simply admire a problem. He wanted to change it. He wanted to intervene as well. And he developed a whole field called action science around how you intervene in that. And I had the chance to learn many of his methods, the first of which was to use something called the 2-column case method. And Chris used to say to people, could you tell me about a challenging interaction that you had that is representative of the kinds of things that you want to handle better? But tell it to me in a particular format. Draw a line down the page. On the right-hand side, tell me what you said, and then what they said, and what you said, and what they said, almost as if you're writing the script of a play. And on the left-hand column, I want you to tell me all the things that were going through your head that you didn't say. Basically, your unspoken thoughts and feelings. And I had the chance to read hundreds and hundreds of these cases from consultants and clients and people around the world. And I started to realize that once you kind of strip away some of the venting and the frustration, there's really important stuff in people's left-hand columns, in their unspoken, that they're not telling the other person. That if that other person only knew, everybody would be better off. They would make better decisions together. They'd be closer. They'd learn more. Things like, I can see the fatal flaw in your plan that you can't see. Or things like, this is why your students are demotivated by you, or your team isn't listening to you. Or here's how I'm experiencing you. Or here's an idea that I'm sure you don't want to hear. All these kinds of things that if you ask the other person, they absolutely would want to know these things, but they never get to find out. And so over time, I started to see this is a treasure trove of wisdom, of insight, of collective genius that every one of us is surrounded by, that too often we don't get the chance to tap into. And so it was a problem that I first observed And then as I started to step into operating and leadership roles myself, it's a problem I personally suffered from and experienced as well, because I found out things that, only way too late when things nearly blew up. But thankfully, I also learned from Chris and other mentors methods to do something about this problem, methods to actually unleash that that hidden wisdom from people around us. I started to get a chance to teach that in my first job out of college at a place called Monitor Group. And the people who experienced this professional development said, this is the most powerful stuff I've ever seen, not just for my work relationships, but for my relationship with my spouse and my kids and, all of that. And I didn't invent it, but I realized that I had inherited something incredibly valuable. And then over time, as I started to, go into more operating roles and suffer some of these challenges myself, I began to learn about additional tools, things like psychological safety and other concepts like that, all of which really served as the foundation of my own leadership and of my efforts to develop other people. And then a few years ago, I said, I want to pay it forward. This is not captured in a way that I think is accessible to lots of people. I want to be able to capture it in that way. And so this book was really an effort to take everything that has forged me through Chris and people like David Cantor and Amy Edmondson and other mentors, and pay it forward to other people.
Well, how powerful to think of taking what Chris Argyris says and combining with what Amy Edmondson says. I mean, that's just a natural marriage of two great sets of thinking. Absolutely. Creating a setting where a person can say what's on their mind, but also recognizing often people don't do that. I loved Argyris's, I shouldn't say I love it, but a really resonant concept is that idea of skilled incompetence. We get really good at keeping ourselves from learning. So
Exactly.
How did your experiences at Transcend and Teach for America, how did they shape the book?
So at Teach for America, they were actually a client of mine while I was at Monitor for 5 years. And I consulted to them and helped them think through different growth plans. And at the end of those 5 years, their founder and CEO at the time, Wendy Kopp, said, hey, why don't you come run part of the organization at Teach for America? And I initially took it as a 2-year leave of absence from Monitor. At the end of those 2 years, I had fallen in love with education, and I realized, this is some of the most ambitious, talented, caring, hard-charging people that I've ever worked with, far more than many of my corporate clients. I felt like these were my people. So I ended up staying at Teach for America for a decade. And I would say Teach for America really forged me as a leader by helping me see that even if I'm curious to learn from other people, even if I think I'm asking the right questions, that doesn't guarantee they're going to tell me the honest answers. Especially working across lines of difference, whether that's gender difference, racial difference, other kinds of background differences, et cetera. All of that can diminish psychological safety. And so it really added to everything that I learned from Chris Argyris and others by recognizing that it's not just enough to be curious and ask questions. As a leader, you have to create the conditions for people to tell you their truth, especially if it's a hard truth. And I learned that the hard way. And over and over, I think I started to get better at it, but I made a lot of mistakes as a leader, particularly in situations that felt like they were high stakes and fast moving. But it taught me a lot. Transcend is the organization I co-founded about a decade ago, together with Elan Samoa, who's now the CEO of the organization. And Transcend works with school communities across the country who are looking to reimagine what school can be, to move beyond the industrial factory model of school towards something that better prepares learners for today and for the fast-changing future. And one of our deepest precepts as an organization is that the answers to where a community should go lie in the community, that the young people, educators, families, community members, and leaders, their ideas, their insights, their voices need to shape the design process, need to shape the innovation process, but they're often not put in that position to do that. And so all that I had learned about asking questions and curiosity and creating inclusive spaces really forged the DNA of a lot of our thinking at Transcend around community-based design, where our work starts by listening to learners and asking them questions and sitting down with them for 45 minutes or an hour and asking them about their experiences at school. And when we do that with many educators, they say, I've never actually had the opportunity to sit down for 45 minutes with a kid and just ask them about their experiences. And I cannot unhear what they told me. Some of the things about how safe or unsafe they feel, how motivated or demotivated they feel at school, how challenged or bored they feel. And so the power of starting with inquiry and asking questions is really at the center of Transcend's work as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to learn with people, you pretty much need to know what they're saying. I mean, it's pretty hard to have a learning organization if people don't share what's on their minds. It's pretty hard to have a learning conversation if the other person's withholding most of the important, or you're withholding
That's
most of
right.
the important things. So,
And it's amazing. And I discovered this both the hard way, but also through research for the book, how prevalent that withholding or even partial withholding is. And it's not just in organizations as well. One statistic I came across is that somewhere between 60 and 80% of Americans have said they withhold things from their doctor about their own health. Things like, I'm not exercising the way you think I am. I didn't take that medicine, all those kinds of things. And I think to myself, if we're withholding information that could literally be life and death for our own health, imagine all the other lower stakes things that are also getting withheld.
No, that's something worth unpacking. That's really interesting. One thing, I've been working on a book with two friends of mine, John Campbell and Christian Van Nieuwerburg, and in the book we talk about telling conversations versus what we call a partnership conversation. You can call it a collaborative conversation, and what we hypothesize is that when people are in collaborative conversations, they sometimes think it's a telling conversation. And so they don't want to go against what's being shared because they feel like they have to comply because they're in a telling conversation. The idea is there isn't really choice. If you didn't do what I've asked you to do, I wouldn't be happy with where we are. But in a collaborative conversation, you have choice. I really want to hear your opinion. And so we feel it's really important for leaders up front to say, just so you know, this is a partnership conversation. So I want you to tell me what's on your mind. This is a telling conversation. So there's no here. We can talk about how it happens. In fact, you could move from a telling to a collaborative conversation or a partnership conversation. So I think that's one thing we've been thinking about it as a way to make it happen. But tell me, the title, Ask, how did you come to that title? What's the story behind the title?
So the story behind the title is the original title for the book was The Unspoken, which is basically all the stuff that people are thinking and feeling and not telling you.
Sounds like a punk rock band,
Yeah, exactly. My agent said it was too negative. No one would want to read a book called
a horror movie too,
Yeah, exactly. And I said, well, the solution to the unspoken is what I call the ask approach. So he said, why don't we call it Ask? So it basically came to Ask. And then the subtitle is basically just trying to say it really is possible to tap into the hidden wisdom. And it's not just something for work. It's also something for life as well.
So in the book, you have these this 5-step ask approach.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if we could walk through the 5 steps, and I'll just name one and you can tell me about it. Maybe we can go back and forth on each of the approaches.
That sounds perfect. Yeah. Maybe just to say at the start, the Ask approach is a collection of these 5 practices that are all grounded in science and research, all tested in different kinds of leadership situations, and that when put together, I think give us the greatest chance of tapping into this unspoken insight that people have around us.
So, for example, if you're curious but you don't make it safe, it's not going to be as powerful as if you make it safe. And
That's right.
It's kind of a multiplier effect.
They reinforce each other.
Right. And that first one is choose curiosity. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So to me, at the root of learning from other people has to be curiosity. If we're not curious and we just try to ask questions or try to go through the motions, it's completely inauthentic. People will see through it. It'll feel like a gimmick. On the other hand, if we're genuinely curious, when people can tell that we really want to learn from them, we radiate an energy that people want to tell us things. A mentor of mine, Diana Smith, said, has a saying, which is, the desire to know cultivates the willingness to tell. So our curiosity engenders in other people a desire to share with us. And I don't look at curiosity as a trait that some people have and other people lack. I don't look at it as a state of mind, like I'm feeling curious, I'm not feeling curious. I really look at it as a choice. It's a decision that is always available to us. And when we choose curiosity, we're centering in our minds one single question, which is simply, what can I learn from this person? And when we center that question, what can I learn from this person? It tends to push away other questions like, why are they such a jerk? Or how do I get them to do what I want them to do? Or how do I get out of here? Or whatever. And instead invites more questions into our mind like, well, what was their intention? And what do they see that I don't see? And how do they look at the situation? And how are they experiencing my impact? And so on. And so by centering that question, what can I learn from that person, from this person? That's really, the beginning of choosing curiosity.
Yeah, you quote one of my friends, Michael Bungay Stanier, who says,
"Yes,
be curious just a little bit longer."
I love that.
Just try to be a little bit more curious. So, what about make it safe? That's the second one. First thing is to enter into the conversation, open, curious, wanting to. There's a guy, Brad Stats. He wrote a book called "Never Stop Learning." He's the dean of Duke University. He said the smartest people he meets all say, I expect to learn from every person I meet. Every conversation, I feel that person. Doesn't matter who they are, they have something to teach me. So that strikes me as the curiosity idea.
I totally agree. I completely agree. There is literally everyone has something that they can teach us. But if we're in that curious mindset, and then so make it safe. To your earlier point is a recognition that even if I'm curious to learn from you, if you don't feel safe telling me your truth, especially if it's a hard truth, I'm not going to learn it. And so making it safe is really creating psychological safety at the interpersonal level, reducing the barriers for people to tell you what they really think and feel. And in the book, I talk about 3 strategies for doing that. I can just quickly name them.
Yeah.
The first one is really around creating connection. And so a big part of safety is, do people feel like they know you and you know who they are? And the most important time to create connection is not right when you need it, but as well before you need it. It's the idea of digging your well before you're thirsty. But it's also about the time and space and place of where you're having the connection. So in my research for the book, I talked to CEOs because CEOs are notorious for not getting the truth from people. People tell CEOs what they think that it's going to make them look good or what the CEO wants to hear. And I said to these CEOs of big iconic corporations like Kraft or Medtronic, I said, how did you get the truth out of people? And the common thing they said is, if I want someone to tell me the truth, I'm not going to drag them into my office and make them sit across the big CEO desk from me and assume they're going to feel safe. I'm going to do it where they're comfortable. We're going to go on a ride along together. We're going to take a walk. We're going to eat at the cafeteria. Whatever it is, there was no single answer other than wherever the other person is going to feel most comfortable.
Right.
That's where you make the connection. So that's part is making a connection. Another part is opening up. So it's essentially, if we want the other person to open up, we got to show our cards first. We got to open up first. Even if you're opening up just to say, here's why I'm asking the question, or here's what I'm struggling with. Here's what I don't know. The more vulnerable we are in opening up, the safer other people will feel in being vulnerable themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third piece I call radiating resilience. And this is essentially letting the other person know and demonstrating in your behavior that I can handle your truth. If you say something tough, I'm not going to crumble. I'm not going to take it out on you. I'm not going to punish you. I'm resilient. I want that. And that can be as simple as saying to the other person, look, I can imagine this must have been frustrating for you. If that's the case, I really would be interested to hear that. So there's different ways that you can radiate that type of resilience, and then you've got to live it out once they do share it with you.
So it sounds like if I'm an instructional coach, meeting the teacher in their classroom would be an optimal setting, as opposed to coming to my little office if I'm lucky enough to have an office. Like meeting the person where they are would be a big part of it. And then that kind of mutual vulnerability, opening up to them would be a key part of that too.
I think that's right. And I imagine for some teachers, meeting them in the classroom is a comfortable setting. But another way to do it is just to ask them where would be the most comfortable place, for you to do it. And some of them may have different answers too.
Yeah, that's a good point. They may want to get out of that classroom.
They may want to get out of the classroom. Maybe other, students are going to be walking into the classroom, and so they're not going to, feel safe, or those kinds of things.
All right. So then the third one is pose quality questions.
Yes. So this is the heart of the ask approach. And this is a recognition that the quality of the questions we ask determines the quality of the learning that we get. And not all questions are equally high quality. My definition of a quality question is simply a question that helps us learn something important. And one of the things I've been fascinated by is that so many of us in our work, whether teachers or coaches or managers or, executives or consultants, ask questions for a living because we have conversations for a living. But very few of us are actually taught what makes for a high quality question. And it turns out there's a taxonomy of questions that are high quality that I think is analogous to the kinds of tools that people have in many different professions. For example, a surgeon has, their scalpel and this and that and all the different tools that they need. As professional conversationalists, we also there's a repertoire, there's a taxonomy of questions. It's just not taught to us. And so this chapter is really about exposing what is that taxonomy of high quality questions that we can use for different purposes. So just to give you one example of one strategy, there's a strategy that I talk about called request reactions. And request reactions is simply, telling something to someone or making a request or giving some feedback and then pausing and saying, hey, what's your reaction to that? How does that strike you? How does that sit with you? What does that make you think? What might I be missing? Any of those questions greatly increases the chances that we will hear their thinking about our thinking. So if there's holes in our thinking, we'll be more likely to discover it. If they disagree or have a reaction to our thinking, we'll be more likely to discover that too. And I think a lot of us assume, well, they're going to tell us their reaction. But quite often, especially if they don't feel safe, people don't tell us their reactions because they don't know if we want to know their reactions. So by asking that, any number of those questions, we significantly increase our chances of really hearing what someone else is thinking. That's just one of the probably dozen or so strategies in the taxonomy.
Yeah, so I think if I'm coaching, I'm thinking, curiosity communicates, I think you have something valuable to say. So I don't jump right to telling you what to do.
Yeah.
I start by first off saying, I love one of Michael Bungay-Stanier's questions. You've probably thought a lot about this. What do you think you might do? That question communicates you've got valuable things and I want to hear you before I say. And he would say, if someone says, just tell me what to do, he said, well, I could do that. But first, I'd really love to hear what you have to say. I think I want to hear you first. That's that curiosity. Then you add psychological safety to it. And then what do you think about the idea of having like a collection of favorite questions that you can use at different points? Not that you would talk robotically, but, for example, my partner, Jenny, has a question. When you're not doing your job, what do you love to do?
Yeah.
That little question always yields something interesting. You'll say, oh, I'm into making beer, or I like to do photography or whatever.
Yeah. I love the idea of having a repertoire of questions.
Right.
And the broader and deeper our repertoire, especially if they're high quality questions, the more degrees of freedom we have in any conversation and the more we can therefore learn.
Yeah. It occurs to me, I started thinking about that because of Robert Putnam's work.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about questions like, what leads you to believe? Having those I call them question recipes you can use. So that's...
Yeah, exactly.
As I read your book, I thought, questioning is a life skill. It's not just a work skill. It's not just a coaching skill. If I'm sitting down with a human being and we're sharing our time together, I should ask them a question that's going to lead to a deeper conversation rather than, how's your day going or superficial things like that. So,
amen. You're speaking my love language.
Yeah, well, I learned it from you. So number 4 is listen to learn.
Yeah. So this is basically to say, once we ask the question, how much we learn all comes down to how well we listen. Most of us are far worse listeners than we think we are. There's 96% of people think that they're good listeners, but we typically retain less than half of what we hear. One of my other mentors at Monitor alongside Chris was someone named David Cantor, who was a founder of the field of family systems therapy. And then he started to apply that same set of methods to teams as in organizations as well. And he talks about how people can speak in 3 different languages. One of them he called meaning, which I've translated to say content. The next one, emotion. And the third one, action. And if we can listen through those 3 channels, we can literally triple the amount that we hear. Typically, we gravitate towards one. My natural one is content. But just the same way that a music aficionado, can listen for the percussion and the harmony and the vocals and, many different things, they get a far richer and more complex sense of the piece. If we can train ourselves to listen through those 3 channels, we can hear many more things that someone is communicating whether aloud or non-verbally, than we would otherwise hear. And so a big part of listening to learn is learning to listen through those three channels. And then in the chapter, I talk about strategies for how to do that as well.
Well, that would, to my mind, be crucial for coaches. It's probably the most important skill. The combination of questions and listening. I always say questioning and listening are like skating is to ice hockey. You want to play the game, you have to be able to do those two things. But I love the nuts and bolts specifics of what you. And then the last thing is reflect and reconnect. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this is my favorite of the five. Probably not surprisingly, because I'm sort of a geek for learning. And reflection is how we learn. It's reflection is how we convert our experiences into insights and our insights into action. And I think a lot of times reflection gets a bad rap. People think, I don't have time to reflect. It's esoteric. I'd have to go on a meditation retreat or whatever. But I think reflection can be very practical. And so I introduce a method called sift it and turn it. And sift it is just to simply say, if somebody told you 20 things, what are the 3 or 4 most important ones of what they told you? Really sifting out the true nuggets. Sometimes it's helpful to get a friend or a partner to help you sift it through so that you don't accidentally sift out the wrong stuff. And then turn it is just turning it over in your mind 3 times systematically. So the first turn is to say, based on what I heard, how does that affect my story about this person or about the situation or the issue? Maybe it changes an assumption that I made, or maybe it gives me a new sense of nuance of what's going on. The second is, how does it affect my steps? What actions should I take based on this? And then the third turn, which is the deepest one, is how does it affect what I call my stuff, my deeper biases, assumptions, worldviews, ways of being in the world? And that's usually where the richest learning can come. And so sifting it and turning it really gives us the chance to truly squeeze out the insights from people. But it's not a one-way process. The Ask approach is not about just extracting for our own benefit. And that's why I call it reflect and reconnect. So the reconnect part is then to say, let me take those learnings and go back to the other person and say, hey, thank you for sharing that with me and for taking the time. And if it felt like a risk, thank you for taking the risk. And let me tell you what I learned. And let me tell you what I'm going to do with what I learned. And let me ask you, is that what you're hoping I would learn? Is there something different I would learn? And that act of reconnecting in that full way, I think, is very rare. And it shows the other person, A, they didn't waste their time. B, they were really powerful and influential because they caused you to learn and be changed based on that conversation. And C, I think it brings you closer to increase the chances that kind of learning in both directions will continue to happen over time.
That's so cool. I just coached somebody this morning from Shanghai, actually. And you're making me think I should write him back and say, here's what I learned from our conversation, which is something I never would have thought of doing before this conversation.
Wow.
Is that the idea?
That's exactly the idea. And you could add on to it a question, which is then, how does this match what you're hoping I would learn?
Right.
Is there anything else I should have learned?
Right. Oh, that's so cool. I love Michael's question. What was most useful? At the end of a coaching conversation. I used to hate that question because I thought it was so egotistical. It's like, tell me how great this coaching session was. What was most useful? But I've learned what it does is it helps people consolidate. They bring people to zone in on what's most important. He calls it the learning question. And so on that. Why don't you tell us a bit about Transcend and how you're partnering with schools and what educators could learn about that?
Sure. So Transcend is a national nonprofit organization. We work with school communities across the United States. And actually part of my new role now is to also explore international presence of Transcend as well. But we work with communities in this process I mentioned called community-based design. Right. And it's basically bringing together young people, educators, families, community leaders, administrators to ask the question, what do we want for our graduates? What kinds of mindsets, knowledge, skills, values, characteristics do we want to be fostering in the young people that we're learning? And then based on what we know about how learning happens, what are the experiences that they need in order to actually foster those things in them? And then we work back and say, well, if these are the experiences that we need to foster, what does that mean for how school should be designed? What should the schedule look like? How should we think about space? How should we think differently about roles? What about content? How do we demonstrate mastery of learning, et cetera? And so we enable communities to essentially rethink what they want school to be in their communities, so that kids are truly able to thrive. And oftentimes the answer to those questions is school would look a lot different than it currently does, because most communities are running a model that has been designed probably 100 years ago. We call it the factory model or the industrial model, and it has been incrementally tweaked in important ways, but it hasn't been fundamentally redesigned in most cases. And so once communities have that vision, we help them to go through an R&D process, research and development process of piloting things and say, all right, well, we don't have to swallow the whole change all at once. Let's think about how might math look different if that were the case? Or how might the afternoon look different? Or how might advisory look different? And start to try that out, pilot it, iterate over time, and then say, all right, now what's the next thing? And what's the next thing? And what's the next thing? And as communities go through that design journey, as we call it, two things happen. One is the design shifts, which leads to better experiences and better outcomes for young people. But also they develop what we call conditions that enable that change to persist over time. So they develop a coalition where people are on the same page. They develop a conviction about how is this important. They develop a culture of learning and innovation. They build their capacity for doing those kinds of things. And so this process is as much a technical process as it is a human and adaptive process where those conditions deeply matter, which we think about those conditions as the soil that everything grows in. And so we pay as much attention to the soil as we do to the technical aspects of what's going on.
Yeah, I got just two jump off thoughts.
Yeah.
One of them is that what I love about the idea is that for lack of better terms, the stakeholders are partners in the process. We're not just doing a thing to them. They're co-constructing it with you, which is kind of our approach to coaching. The teacher, we start by saying, okay, what are your kids not doing that you'd like them to be able to do? And it's driven by what they think about when they drive home is what we should be focused on in coaching. It's the way we would. And the second part of it, what I was thinking about it is that we have this concept of freedom within form, that you have a structure. But then within the structure, and the structure would be what you would co-construct, but then the structure allows you to do adaptive change. It's an agile. So we're not stuck with the structure. You need a structure to be adaptive, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Exactly. We think about it, I think in an analogous way as a third alternative to how school change often happens. On the one hand, sometimes it happens in a very top-down way. Right. Which often doesn't end up leading to true commitment, true change, true sustainability. Oftentimes, on the other way, it's just left to the teachers. Just figure this out, and so it's completely bottom up, which I think is unfair to people who are already overburdened. This is a third way where there is a structured process. There are structured inputs. There's expertise that gets brought to the process. But it's through that structure that it invites participation and ultimately agency from the very people who, in our view, are the heroes of the work, which is the community itself.
Do you know the hope theory that out of University of Kansas? So Shane Lopez is one of the people, and Rick.
Actually, don't.
But
I'd love to hear.
They say is hope involves three simple things. So, of course, it's not this simple, but one of them is a preferred future.
Yeah.
One of them is a pathway to the preferred future, and one of them is agency, that the pathway will, or multiple pathways that will take me there. And so as we go through our coaching cycle, we say, in a very real sense, what we do is we bring hope, because we help the teacher identify a goal, then we help the teacher identify a pathway, and then by monitoring progress with the teacher as a partner, we build agency, because they can say, this is actually working. So
I love that.
I think your process would accomplish the same thing. Collectively, you would bring a bunch of people together to say, where do we want to be? How are we going to get there? And then what successes are we have? What adaptation? And then agency would be built as you see progress as you move forward.
That's right. That's right. I love that.
Yeah, that's very cool. So if people wanted to learn more about Transcend, what's the best way for them to find out about it?
So two things. One is our website, transcendeducation.org. And you can get in touch with us there. You can find out a lot more about examples of schools that have worked with us and our team and so on. We also, about 2 months ago, released a book called Extraordinary Learning for All. And so a lot of our tools and methods and case studies are captured in that book as well.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to our conversation we haven't had a chance to talk about?
No, I think we've really covered it, and I really appreciate the questions, and also just getting to know you and seeing some of the parallels in our methods and processes too.
It's very fun. I'm very grateful for the book, for the conversation, and hopefully for future conversations. That would be
feel exactly the same way.
Awesome.